Please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Just a minute. Okay. Professor Nagappa, sir, are you here, sir? Professor Muni?
Yeah, I'm around, yes.
Okay. Then we will we'll move to the next session. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the National Institute of Advanced Studies and the International Strategic and Security Studies program, let me warmly invite you for this evening discussion as a part of K. Subrahmanyam Memorial Lecture. I'll request Professor Nagappa to formally introduce the lecture, the series, and also our speaker. Let me start with a thank you note for Professor Muni for agreeing to give this lecture on an important theme, and also as a part of the workshop. We discussed the neighborhood today. Thank you, sir, for being with us and agreeing. We were hoping to see you today. It's very unfortunate you are in Bangalore, but still we are not able to meet with you. It just the last 2-3 days development we could not do this. And kindly note, we would have a few young scholars from other institutions will also be joining, and we are also planning to live stream it so that others could also benefit from Professor Muni's lecture, and also as a part of our ISSP's outreach to reach out to a larger audience. It's there in YouTube. Harini, would you like to tell us how we are doing it?
I will share the link on the chat box here.
Okay.
And they can forward it to people if they want.
Okay. Now, with that note, let me once again thank Professor Muni for agreeing to this, and hand over the proceedings to Professor Rajaram Nagappa to start the lecture. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Subha. Good afternoon to everyone. Dr. Nayak, I think he must be around. And senior faculty members of NIAS, Professor Muni, Subha Chandran, Professor Srikumar, participants from the morning discussion till now, till all the other sessions, speakers, discussants, participants in the India's Neighbourhood 2022, young scholars, my colleagues and friends. I have great pleasure in welcoming all of you for this event. My special welcome to Professor Muni, our esteemed speaker today. We were hoping, as Subha mentioned in the morning, to welcome Professor Muni in person along with the other interactive people. But unfortunately, situations and constraints have forced us to do this as an offline event. We couldn't do the offline event, and we are now doing an online event. And we actually note a suggestion of my colleague Soundarajan to think of a better term for offline or online. Maybe we should come up with that. I'm sure though we'll miss this one-to-one interaction. I think online a lot of things are still possible, and I'm sure Subha and his team will ensure that we have a lively discussion after listening to Professor Muni. NIAS instituted the K. Subrahmanyam Memorial Lecture in 2011 in memory of the legendary thinker, strategist, and the man we can credit with our nuclear posture and doctrine. The maiden memorial lecture in 2011 was delivered by the late Ambassador Arundhati Ghosh and has been followed by other luminaries, some of whom had known and interacted with the late Dr. Subrahmanyam personally. Among the speakers in subsequent years have included the late Dr. Jaswant Singh, Professor Onkar Marwa, Ambassador Shyam Saran, Dr. S. Jaishankar, and last event was the speaker was Professor C. Raja Mohan. Our thought was on to have this as an annual feature, but in the later years, I think based on the availability of the speakers, their convenience, as well as the pandemic, it's now become sort of more or less once in 2 years event. But then we've really been fortunate that we got excellent people to speak on and provide these memorial talks. Many of the past speakers have dealt on our neighborhood, on our borders, and this has been a recurring theme. Naturally, it's an important theme, so it has to be a recurring theme. In the session so far we've had, in the workshop sessions, experts have expressed their views on the neighborhood trajectories that can be expected in 2022. Professor Muni's experience and talk on India and its neighborhood, I'm sure, will prove to be the icing on this important and complicated topic. The neighborhood is definitely complicated. And in this context, I am tempted to repeat an apocryphal story. The story goes something like this. Maybe many of you perhaps know it already. God was presiding over his cabinet meeting and remarked that when I created the world, I sort of ensured that every country had a fair share of good and favorable conditions on one hand, unfavorable and problematic conditions on the other hand. Then he asked his IT minister to provide a virtual tour of today's world. The first country to be zoomed in, of course, was the US, country of opportunities, leader in technology, big GDP. And on the flip side, high level of inequalities, racial prejudice, cannot manage natural calamities or win wars, cannot push a vaccination agenda. Then on to China. On the surface, everything looked well, rich, powerful, factory of the world. Country has a strife with. On the flip side, country has a strife with every other country. People have no freedom to express their opinion. There were many other flip sides. So the telescopic view of many other countries also showed the good balance of favorable and unfavorable situations. And then the camera focused over India. Country was booming with traffic. All types of cars were there, two-wheelers, three-wheelers. Pandemic was rampant but under control. Many people were wearing masks as a fashion statement, spanning the bridge of the nose and the bottom of the chin and in between locations on the face. Rivers were flowing full, granaries were overflowing. Everyone was free to do what they liked, driving on the footpath, wrong way on the one-way streets. Traffic police were indulgent. Number of agitations were going on, but there was no animosity. And everyone seemed to be in agreement with the live and let live type of philosophy. At this, one of the ministers posed the query to God. He said, God, you said you had planned a fair share of good and bad for all countries, but you seem to have been partial to India. We could see things could be better, but we saw no unfavorable conditions. And then God said, I have given India its share of problems. Have you looked at its neighbors I have given to India? And very rightly, I think that's what we are going to look at. Professor Muni, with his deep insight and erudition, will provide us the state of play and hopefully some solutions to this complicated issue. Professor Muni is no stranger to NIAS, and in our past interactions, I have been enriched, like all of you, with his reading and understanding of the problem. Professor Muni really requires no introduction to this community, but just for the sake of completeness, very briefly, I'm doing, I know, less justice than that, but then I thought we should listen to him, give him all the time. Professor Muni is the emeritus professor at the School of International Studies, JNU. He is academically connected with national and international universities as teacher, guide, and mentor. Professor Muni has also served as a special envoy for the Southeast Asian countries for the UN Security Council reforms and has served as India's ambassador in Laos. Professor Muni is a prolific writer, has to his credit more than 30 books and monographs, in addition to a large number of articles and research papers in both national and international media. He is also the recipient of the prestigious Sri Lanka Ratna Award awarded by the Sri Lankan government. I warmly welcome Professor Muni again and request him to deliver the K. Subrahmanyam Memorial Lecture on India and its neighborhood. Over to you, Professor Muni.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much to you and Nias and also to Subha for inviting me to this workshop. I think since morning I have had a great learning session, knowing about the current and the previous situation in the neighborhood. I'm particularly thankful to you for bestowing this privilege on me to speak at the Subrahmanyam Memorial Lecture. Subrahmanyam has always remained a mentor to most of us, to the entire strategic community of India. He is one of the brightest civil servants who had the courage to speak his mind, whether the governments liked it or not. And for that, he paid a big price. I met him first time in 1967 and have continued to remain in touch with him and also his family, including Dr. Jaishankar. But in 1973, he recruited me for IDSA, which I did not join, though he wanted to give me a raise, which was very unusually generous. And still he said that even if you join JNU, you must come and work with IDSA. So I did later on in the 80s. We were also privileged in the South Asia Center to have him as a visiting professor, despite a lot of resistance from some of the colleagues for various reasons, including that, look, he is a government servant and we need not have him in the university. I brushed it aside, struggled for it, and he was with us. He has, as I said, mentored most of us. And recently, when there was a question of the name change of the IDSA, I stuck my neck out and said, if at all the IDSA's name has to be changed, with no disrespect to Mr. Parikar, it is K. Subrahmanyam, who is the most deserving candidate for the name change of IDSA. I lost the battle. I regret that. But the fact remains that India's strategic thinking has been so highly enriched by Subrahmanyam and his writing that we are even today governed by it. As I said again, you have bestowed a privilege on me to speak in his memory, and I pay my tributes to him. The subject given to me is on India's neighborhood policy and any foreign policy. I need not tell this audience, which is very educated already, that any foreign policy must be rooted into the domestic context and domestic dynamics. And therefore, even India's foreign policy should be viewed in terms of India's own development as a state. In the beginning, India was poor. India has gained economic strength. India felt insecure during the Cold War years. India is now far more confident. And all these changes have actually affected India's foreign policy, including the approach towards the neighbors. Now, when we look at the neighbors, the neighborhood perspective has also evolved. If I take you back to the Nerubian period, you will see that Nehru's neighborhood perspective was civilizational. We had not the border sovereign units around in terms of territory, but in terms of frontiers and in terms of civilization. Iran was a great neighbor. The former Soviet Union, because of its presence in Central Asia, was a great neighbor. China was a great neighbor. Malay civilization, Indonesia was a great neighbor. And Nehru dealt, if you go through his early writings, like Discovery of India or the Glimpses of World History, you find these references to these countries as neighbor. Now that broad perspective got breached, I think, very narrowly, very in a sorry state of affair by partition, when parts of India, parts of British India, if you want to call it, and later on parts of independent India actually became neighbors. And this is what the geostrategic breach which India has to suffer and is suffering even now. Another major change took place in India's neighborhood at that time, soon after the partition, and that was China becoming a neighbor. China was a distant neighbor. Tibet was our neighbor. But the Chinese walked militarily in 1951 into Tibet, and they became a neighbor. And later on also India's neighborhood complexion changed. Uh, I recall creation of Bangladesh, which was in development not perceived in 1947. I also recall the integration of Sikkim, which was a master stroke of, I think, Indian diplomacy in terms of integrating the strategic aspects of India's neighborhood. So you find from civilizational, now we have come to the territorial neighbors, which are sovereign units with us. There is a new dimension to neighborhood also, where people include even the extended neighborhood. And India, if you look at it, almost is centered in Asia. Uh, in a way, every country looks oneself it as a center of Asia. But geographically, I find India centered in Asia with the Western extended neighborhood and the Eastern extended neighborhood. I will not have time and also energy at this time, this stage, to go into both the extended neighbors. But very briefly speaking, the Western neighborhood is very critical to us today. And I'm not going into the history today, largely because of our migratory labor, which is working there and sending us a lot of money, the question of energy, which is so critical, and the whole question of radicalization along the religious lines, which turns sometimes into terrorism, which is impinging upon us in one way or the other. And I think in the last 10 years or 20 years, we have somehow managed a reasonable balance of relations within our Western extended neighborhood. And today, I think India is in a very happy state to have a very normal, functional, useful relationship with Israel, with Iran, with Saudi Arabia. And we are not dragged into the deep conflicts either in Syria or Libya or Iraq or even for Afghanistan for that matter. Afghanistan is affecting us, but we were not militarily involved into that. On the eastern side, there is a very, since the students are around, I want to tell them that historically you must be aware of the fact that India's prosperity and stability has greatly depended on our interaction with the East. It is because of our interaction with the East that from 1st to 15th century, or I would say 1st to 18th century, India was a dominant economic power. And from 15th to 18th century, we shared that status with China. But from 1st to 15th century, India itself accounted for more than 25% of the global wealth. The rest was added by China, and it was an Asian century in that sense, if at all one looks into it. And later on also, even after 90, when we initiated the so-called Look East policy, which has now been re-christianed as Act East policy, India's prosperity has increased to a great deal. You know, the whole region of Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar, Thailand are being called Suvarna Bhumi. We were always associated with that and have huge, what you call cultural footstep into this region, even today in a very prominent manner. So I think it is critical for us to remain very closely identified by our with our Eastern extended neighborhood, which now has again been strategically redefined as Indo-Pacific. And this is where both our security and our economic prosperity would depend in the coming decades and years. I would not go into the extended neighborhood beyond this, because I will emphasize more on the immediate neighbors, which has been the subject of a discussion on our table. But if you have any questions about either of these extended neighbors, I would be very happy to respond to that. Now, as I said, India's state structure has evolved from a weak state, from a colonial state, from an Asian resurgent state. We have become a more powerful, more confident state. And to that extent, our neighborhood policy has also unfolded. To that extent, I would say that this unfolding of the policy may fall into four major phases. I will very briefly flag them. First is, of course, the Nerubian phase. And Nehru, as I said, was oscillating between the civilizational concept and a family concept, because some of the neighbors like Nepal, later on even Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, were taken as a family members for Nehru. And that has both positive as well as negative aspects. The positive aspect was that Nehru felt for these neighbors and almost got involved into every major development which took place in these neighbors. At times, he also leaned very heavily on some of these neighbors, considering them as family members. I remember I've seen letters being written to the prime ministers and the presidents of some of the neighboring countries, or the kings in Nepal, for instance, or in Bhutan, in which he would suggest things which he should not have in terms of the sovereign concept of neighborhood, which later on became a liability for India, and some of the successors of these kings or these prime ministers and the president objected that this is how Nehru used to deal with it. But he dealt with them as a part of family members. He was concerned about them, came forward whenever they were in a trouble, because he looked at the whole neighborhood in the context of Asian resurgence. He had a wider vision of the world, in which he thought within the Cold War context, he should shape whole of Asia and help there. I mean, Myanmar's independence at the time of independence, this was the internal serious trouble. And later on, UNU publicly acknowledged Nehru as a savior of Myanmar at that time, because we organized international assistance for them, also bilateral assistance for them. Similarly, Indonesia, which was taken as a civilizational neighbor, we had international conference on that. So what I want to say is that he dealt with the neighbors in the overall Asian context, but as family members. For instance, he had a personal relationship with leaders like U Nu or Bandaranaike of Sri Lanka, or even for that matter, King Tribhuvan of Nepal, or the Malaysian leader Tun Abdul Razak, with which he used to have a personal, Sukarno, he used to have a personal relations and dealt with them. So that was the Nehruvian, the characteristic of the Nehruvian feature. But all the time, security was dominant, security of India. And of course, prosperity was a less emphasized factor during Nehru's time. Economic development was less, but on security, he emphasized and looked at this, and became a major factor in the transformations. And I'll come to this point in a short while. But he was worried about partition, Pakistan, China. I mean, apparently he chose China for peaceful coexistence because of the Cold War and other reasons. But he knew, and I think Secretary Nirupama Rao's book, latest book, beautifully brings it out. What are the dilemmas which Nehru faced in dealing with China? So Pakistan and the Cold War was a major factor. But there was an effort all the time to deal with the neighborhood as a family, deal with the neighborhood in a civilizational context, deal with the neighborhood in the context of the Asian resurgence. Now, Nehru's successor realized that despite all that, 65, 62, the experiences which happened, they had to cope with the reality. And in coping with the reality, they had to restructure the whole neighborhood's strategic context, which had to be very, very clear. And that started coming up the way India faced the 65 outcome of the 65 conflict with Pakistan. And then, of course, came Bangladesh, which was a very forceful, I mean, the studies that Mr. Chandrasekhar Das Gupta's latest book on Bangladesh tells us several aspects of it. And I would recommend it very strongly. It has come out very recently, as to go into how the Bangladesh, there was a school, and I had incidentally some dialogue with Subrahmanyam on this, because he also joined the group led largely by the US strategic analysts, that India had no strategic culture. And 1971 brought about very clearly that if without a strategic culture, you would not have succeeded in 1971. So if when Indian as a state puts it together, it can really deliver. So 1971 was, I think, we have no time to go into its various nuances and aspects, but a very massive message to restructure the neighbor to become more acceptable to us strategically, because 62 and 65 had given a big jolt to India. 1975, another master stroke, which has not yet been properly analyzed, was the integration of Sikkim through the democratic movement, which of course created various other, and then later on after Mrs. Indira Gandhi also demonstrated nuclear capabilities of India, which was to restore the confidence which had been shaken during the 60s, during Nehru's period. But later on, Rajiv Gandhi's moves into Sri Lanka, into Maldives, very clearly underlined one thing, that we want a neighborhood which is strategically conducive to us. We wanted a neighborhood which is more of an integrated unit rather than a different. But in the whole context, there was one aberration, and that aberration was that India preferred dealing with the neighbors bilaterally, not collectively. The whole idea of regionalism, which has come up later, did not spark much confidence into Nehru's successors when dealing with the neighborhood. So there was a question of reciprocity. India was economically not very prosperous to be very generous with the neighbors, even to the extent of but there was a very strong desire to integrate with the neighbors. And this is where, even in terms of re-engaging with Pakistan, the Shimla Agreement is an example of that. Not only Shimla Agreement, Mrs. Gandhi's efforts and then Rajiv Gandhi's efforts to open up re-engagement with China after years of almost no interaction with that country after 1962. So this was the second phase of our neighborhood policy, in which the strategic context of India's neighborhood was redefined, and a great deal of self-confidence was brought into dealing with the neighbors. The third phase I call is with the Gujarat doctrine, when a regionalism starts emerging as a strong force, in which what he underlined was non-reciprocity, that we will not be expecting anything from the neighbors, but we will do whatever we think is necessary for the neighbors. And I think Gujarat remained a prime minister for a very short time. I wish he had almost all in the neighbors respected Gujarat doctrine. Everybody liked that kind of an approach and was delighted that India is going to deal with them with far more greater respect than what they felt earlier had been dealt by them. Even Atal Bihari's, there was a continuation of I see a continuation of the Gujarat doctrine during Atal Bihari, as also Dr. Manmohan Singh's UPA regime, Atal Bihari's NDA regime. He was saying we are building a community of the neighbors in this way. The great Lahore Bus Service, which was a landmark effort on the part of dealing with Pakistan. Under the UPA, the backdoor channel, which almost brought about a solution of the Kashmir problem between Musharraf and Dr. Manmohan Singh, except for the Musharraf's falling out. The problems were in Pakistan. not because of us. I think we would have seen a very different outcome of that kind of a negotiations. So there was a great deal of effort in building a community of the neighbors and a realization, a clear realization that India cannot play a major role in the world affairs without carrying all its neighbors along with it. And then after the 90s, because Gujarat Doctrine came after the 90s, India had economic prosperity. So there was an offer of joining in India's prosperity to the neighbors, that regional cooperation was an accepted norm in India's dealing with the neighbors. So it was bilateral as well as regional so far as this new development was concerned. And you found, I think, one of the major product of this period was the Ganga Water Agreement with Bangladesh, which was lingering in for years. Or, as I said, on Pakistan with the back channels, almost close to some sort of a workable solution on Kashmir. Whether it would have lasted or not is a different matter. And plus, all kind of confidence building measures with China, which we had in from 1993 onwards, including on the border 1995, the guidelines how we should resolve our border. The Chinese have dumped them into the dustbin now and are not bothering about it, but they were worked out, and they are the ones who have begged out of India. So this was the third phase. And in the fourth phase, I call Prime Minister Modi's neighborhood first. And that neighborhood first, it has again not been gone into very deeply. To a very important extent, it was prompted by the Chinese assertive diplomacy or assertive approach to South Asia. The BRI was born in 2013. And I think India had to do something in order to ensure that neighborhood remained with it. And I think with probably that intention, neighborhood first policy was launched. There were some flaws in the UPA's approach earlier, particularly Dr. Manmohan Singh, where he did not put in the personal touch. I mean, he did not visit any of the neighbors. And the kind of diplomacy was largely through the statecraft rather than in a personal note. I think this is where Prime Minister Modi has put its stamp on what you call the neighborhood first policy, where there is a huge deal of personal touch. And initially, it created a lot of fanfare, a lot of expectations out of the neighbors that now India will deal under Prime Minister Modi in a very generous manner, in a more accommodative manner. Unfortunately, within months, I think the neighborhood first started getting derailed. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One reason was that there was a lot of India's input into what was India's interest, which were really put in, had always been put in, but far more assertively than what it was. And this was found during, negotiations with Pakistan in July of 2014, when on the Hurriyat issue, the trade talks were broken. Now, there was the justification for not letting Hurriyat to be played upon by the Pakistanis. I am fully for it. But for stopping Hurriyat to interact with Pakistan, we could have done it in Srinagar. Hurriyat leaders could have been stopped in Srinagar, but they came to Delhi and they met the Pakistani High Commissioner and also the Pakistani delegation which had come for the trade. And then we broke off the trade relations which came up during that time. Then it got reflected into the Kathmandu summit, where the entire blame lies on Pakistan, because it was not willing to have the connectivity issue worked out. Pakistan was not willing to let India go to Afghanistan for trade and economic matters. And therefore, they blocked the connectivity projects. Now, 2013, China started BRI. 2007, India proposed and got it accepted into the SAARC, the whole connectivity idea. But we could not carry it forward largely because of obstructions from countries like Pakistan. And of course, not that much of an economic input which could really be put into that. So we ran into problems under the neighborhood first with Pakistan, then with Nepal on the constitutional issue, on the issue of Tarai, which has been discussed partly recently in earlier, on issue of Sri Lanka, where Rajapaksa blamed India for interfering into his elections in 2015, on the question of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi's and the military's regime, 13th Amendment in terms of Sri Lanka, which we have been continuously talking about. I think these were the some of the issues which I would say vitiated the very creative idea of the neighborhood first, and very powerful hopes and expectations which Prime Minister Modi raised in the neighborhood because of its own very active and dynamic interaction with the neighbors today. Because he frequently visited the neighbors, he looked into the what I call the disease of India's foreign policy in terms of delivery deficit, that we make promises and do not deliver to the neighbors. He went into that and gone into very deeply. But because of the internal political and other issues, I think the whole thing was spoiled. And now what we are doing is sort of a course correction, that we are trying to cultivate the leaders in the neighborhood, whether it is Oli in Nepal, who has been very unpredictable so far as bilateral relations are concerned, or the Rajapakshas in Sri Lanka, or for that matter, I think we discussed Myanmar today, but we should have gone into the details of Foreign Secretary's visit there in terms of cultivating the army there without offending it, keeping our stakes with the democratic factions there itself. So we are now trying, and I call it for analytical purposes, Neighborhood First 2.0, when we are doing a course correction in terms of personally accommodating the sentiments and the egos of the neighborhood leaders, increasing developmental assistance, and as I said, improving the delivery deficit which is there. Still, we are working on the Neighborhood First 2.0. It has several positive aspects. We have kept good relations with countries like Bangladesh, but we have continued to put the whole of SAARC into jeopardy. This morning there was reference to BIMSTEC, which we think as an alternative to SAARC. I don't think it will become an alternative to SAARC. We can build up BIMSTEC, which is a very critical strategic area, into the Bay of Bengal. But SAARC, which has been forced into ICU, I would say, no summit since 2016, last 5-6 years, and no hope of a summit. And that's true. Even Pakistan has to assure and implement the expectations on the terrorism front, which Pakistan is not willing to improve, even on the connectivity front. Even now, under Taliban Afghanistan, Pakistan has a huge reservation in allowing India to have trade and interaction with them, even to feed the hungry people of Afghanistan under the Taliban regime, which Pakistan has brought about. I mean, Subha presented an excellent report on Pakistan. I think one of the victories of Pakistan in 2021 was the exit of the US from Afghanistan, where it may have implications which may be very costly to Pakistan, but the fact that Pakistan today that is why China and US cannot afford to avoid Pakistan. China would not avoid even for India's reasons, even for Ladakh, even for Kashmir and the Himalayas, where they have developed their own stakes under BRI. So that apart, but the fact remains, and this is what we are facing today into the neighborhood. So I think these are the 4 phases of India's foreign policy. Let me run through quickly as to what has come out of these 4 phases. I think one thing which is very creative and positive about India's involvement is that India has a transformational role in the neighborhood. There is, and I say it with all the responsibility which I have in terms of my understanding of the region, that there has been no major development in any of the neighbors which has been brought about without India's involvement. Whether it is a constitutional change, whether it is a social transformation, whether it is even in Pakistan. Bangladesh is one, even when Bhutto was being assassinated, first put in jail, being assassinated, those who know Pakistan know that India allowed PPP to come and take shelter in India. And we always stood by the democratic forces there. In Sri Lanka, the Sinhala Tamil conflict, which is there, and it has certain implications, and I'll come to them. So India has played a major transformational role, both in terms of geopolitics. Creating Bangladesh is a geopolitics. Integration of Sikkim is a geopolitics. But the change from Rana rule to monarchy's assertion in Nepal is a systemic transformation which took place. In Sri Lanka, systemic transformation took place. In Maldives, systemic transformation took place. We have stood by democracy for a long time in Myanmar, systemic transformation. So for systemic transformations, as also for the geopolitical change, India has played a transformational role in South Asia. And as I said, we can continue to discuss it. I mean, you look at one single example of Maoist mainstreaming in Nepal. There have been Maoist-like insurgencies all over the world. Tell me where this insurgency, this kind of insurgency, was translated into a political, diplomatic, democratic transformation. If the same kind of a development would have taken place in Europe, I'm sure half a dozen Nobel Peace Prizes must have been given to those who did about it, not in South Asia. So we have done the kind of changes which have not been globally widely recognized, but they are of great transformational values. Under this transformational role, there are values which have governed India. And there are 2 significant values which have been governed, but under the priority of security. The one value has been democracy and inclusive society, whether it is a question of Sri Lanka and democracy in case of Nepal, in case of Pakistan, in case of Myanmar, in case of Bangladesh, everywhere, India's transformation role has been driven by desire for democracy and desire for an inclusive society in there. But whenever these 2 things have come in conflict with India's security and strategic interests, we have made a compromise. And we have made a compromise in favor of security, not in favor of democracy, not in favor of the inclusive society nature. Look at the whole question of democracy in Bhutan. Bhutan king has brought about. But the question of democracy was started by the Nepalese way back in the late 50s, mid 50s and late 50s. And we were not in favor of that, largely because the stability of Bhutan would have been disturbing our security in one way or the other. In case of Nepal, the Tarai issue has been taken up now. But for the past 50 years, we never took the Tarai up issue, largely because of, and even today, We have largely left the Tarai wherever it was in terms of that. It's a matter of great discussion, but we know that the hill dominant community is the dominant ruling community in Nepal, and we have made our adjustments with them, largely in the overall security and stability context. So the transformational role has been governed and driven by the values of security, value of democracy, value of inclusive society. And in all the three, the hierarchy has been security is the top, where we have made compromises, we have made excuses. Now, again, this transformation role has swung like a pendulum from brilliance to blunders, from breakdowns to breakthroughs. In the sense that we have done tremendous amount of uniquely successful transformational change, and all that transformational change has got soon collapsed, and we could not save the kind of transformations which were bring about. I'll give you two examples. There are many which I can give, but short of time. One is Bangladesh. 71, we create Bangladesh. 75, we are an outcast in Bangladesh, and could not save the kind of regime which was there. We knew that there was helicopters were thrown, and Mujibur Rahman was advised to do something. He did not do. We could not persuade him, and the whole system collapsed. And as a result of that collapse, almost for 15 to 20 years, India was out of Bangladesh. And Bangladesh was back to the Eastern Pakistan kind of a situation, militarily and others. In Nepal, 2005, 2006, we brought about the transformation of the Maoist into a political party, a democratic party. Almost everybody praised India, that India has done a great thing by resolving the Maoist problem, which they are now changing. Within 2 years, everybody was abusing India for not doing the great thing or interfering into Nepal. So what has happened is that brilliant changes have been transformed into a lot of blunders. And this raises the question that why has it been done? Why it is that the blunders have occurred there? There are a few reasons which I want to flag. We will have to discuss and write in details later what are the drivers of. One is the existential imbalance in South Asia. India is too big, too huge. And a little India is present in almost all the neighbors, vitiating their identity perception. There is a little bit of India in each of the neighbors. Whereas in India, we don't feel each of the neighbors. And we are too huge economically, militarily, socially, population-wise, territory-wise, anybody, which creates an imbalance. And that imbalance always leads to suspicion and mutual fear and mutual doubt. But this is one of the main reasons behind it into most of the crises which we can solve. Then there are diverse and conflicting stakeholders into neighborhood policy. You take Nepal's policy and there would be a number of stakeholders mutually conflicting and impinging upon the government. You take Sri Lanka policy, number of stakeholders. You take Bangladesh policy, number of stakeholders. And these stakeholders are like different agencies of the government. Finance Ministry, Home Ministry, Defense Ministry, Army, intelligence agencies, business communities, bordering states, even people who are married into some of these countries. You know that Tamil leadership was married into Tamil Nadu. The Nepalese leadership is married into Bihar and Rajasthan and various other places all around. Bangladesh, this kind of a social interaction. In fact, I remember repeatedly, I many times mentioned it, I might have mentioned it in Nias also. Haksar once, while talking We were talking in India International Center, and P.N. Huxer, who was the principal secretary to Mrs. Indira Gandhi, he said, when it comes to neighborhood, we are lodged into each other's intestines, which means that anything which happens to them will affect us, and anything which happens to us will affect them. So the question of, the scholars many times write interference. Interference is given. The question arises, interference in whose favor? What is the nature of interference? What is the consequences of interference? Interference per se is unavoidable. Not only from India's side, from their side also. I mean, in India, you had emergency, and Nepali leader, Nepali Congress was fighting for that emergency. You had a Kashmir, you had a Sikkim problem, and the Nepal king was involved in the Sikkim problem. So you have this kind of an interaction, and therefore these conflicting stakeholders and bring out a balance to them becomes a very difficult. Secondly, India is a polarizing factor in all the neighbors. And polarizing factor because we are identified by the social groups there in terms of policy. This morning again was a discussion, so I need not go into the details. In Sri Lanka, we are identified with Tamil. Also because we have not done our diplomacy towards the Sinhalese. We have not invested much in the Sinhalese areas. Now we have started. For the past 10 years, this is being corrected. But earlier, in Nepal, we are identified with Tarai people. Now, it's so confusing to an academic like me that in Sri Lanka, both Sinhalese and Tamils are of Indian origin. And they are fighting against in the name of Indian origin. In Nepal, both Pahadis and the Tarai people are of the Indian origin. And they have India as a conflict ridden. So social identity is one area in which India is treated as a polarizing factor. And within the power struggle which goes on within this country, everybody wants India's support, whether it is Maldives, whether it is Nepal, whether it is Bangladesh. Anyone who doesn't get the support becomes anti-India. And the same group, when it comes to power, becomes pro-India. I mean, this is a dynamics which is not our creation, which is creation of the neighboring countries. So within neighboring countries, because of the power struggles, we have committed, and many times we want a pliant regime. So we don't look at the overall national interest and which group will be more pliant to us in a regime. We seek for that, and sometimes we create a mistake of dividing their problems. Then we have lack of developmental effort. Look, initially, we created roads and airports in countries like Nepal, but such massive projects, and this becomes a factor in view of BRI, which is being done, India had not taken up. India had taken up training, development, scholarship, medical assistance, food assistance, etc., but not major infrastructure projects, which become symbol of, this is done by India. This hall is being created by India. Very little comparatively. So in terms of, and we did not have enough money before the 90s, we did not have enough money to invest into the neighborhood. Now the money, and now China has come up with much more money, and I'll come to that in a short while. So lack of developmental engagement with the neighbors has also been a factor in why we suddenly lose the goodwill which is being created. And lastly, external powers. There is a general view that India doesn't want external powers to be more active in the neighborhood because we think this is our soft belly. I want it to be looked more carefully. What has happened is that India on its own has not been able to manage these neighbors all on their own because of other external powers, and therefore we have sought assistance from others. I'll give you an example. Russia, Soviet Union, and China, we depended upon during the Cold War when we had a major problem from US because of the Cold War. In fact, there is one statement by Nehru saying that, and that is the statement is somewhere around in 1954, not 55, in which he said, if the US thinks that in China and Pakistan, by interfering, they can reduce India's influence, they are mistaken. And that is one reason why we were building peaceful coexistence with China in order to have, and there is a letter which I have seen in which Nehru scolds the Nepali leadership and says that you are having relations with the US, which China tells me you are not telling me. China informed that Nepalese were having closer relations with the US or whatever. You see this kind of, so we were during Bandar Naike's election in the late 50s, when he first came to power in Sri Lanka. There are Nehru Memorial have some documents which show that KGB wanted to support SWRD Bandar Naike's party, and it was brought to Nehru's attention, and Nehru said he had no objection, let it be done. So we have not knowing that we can cope with the foreign pressure at that time, Cold War and the US, we depended upon others. Today, we have a challenge from China, and we are depending again on the US and Japan. Why I'm saying that? Because today there is a debate that, look, we are depending upon, or we are falling back on the support from US and Japan in order to deal with China in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, so on and so forth. In fact, we have always had this balance in terms of wherever the problem has been, we have tried to deal with it. But the external powers, which are not favorable to India, have always done to vitiate the atmosphere against India. I must soon conclude. So what are the challenges? This is how the pendulum has swung, I said, in terms of a major role which is there. The challenges are that, look, we have a neighborhood now which is extremely confident. It is new. It is assertive. It is a lot of turbulence is there, and a nationalism is growing, which is not very conducive because it is a sectarian nationalism. Am I audible? Yeah, I can't see the image, but I am.
We are able to hear you.
All right. So that is one problem which we have to deal with. And in that problem, we will have to improve our own approach. So this is the first problem is that neighborhood is changing fast. There are new people, there are new populations, there are new aspirations, there is a new confidence and new assertion in which our policy, we devote very little time. The foreign ministries, most of the time goes on US and China and Pakistan and various other things. Very little time on neighborhood responses are mostly knee-jerk responses. At the same time, they are crisis responses. When crisis there, you respond. So we have to devote more time. We have to understand the neighbor, which we are not understanding. There are a lot of complacency in Indian diplomacy that, okay, we can deal with this problem in one way or the other. So a lot of this has to be done. And lastly, I would say, under the neighborhood first, there is a great deal of emphasis on soft policy, soft power. in which a lot of cultural and civilizational aspects are being used. And this is where the Indian internal politics, particularly on the communal side, is adversely affecting the neighbor. This morning, again, during Bangladesh, there was a discussion of CAA and National Register of Citizenship. That is one issue. But every now and then, if the Hindu-Muslim issue becomes prevalent in India, please don't forget that it will affect the neighbors. And a lot of radical groups which are there in the neighborhood, like in Bangladesh, they get a strength from this. So we have got to be very careful in seeing that the spillover of Indian internal policy should not adversely affect our neighborhood approach. And the delivery deficit, I said, to a great deal, I think Prime Minister Modi is trying to bridge this delivery deficit, but because of the system and because of economic constraints, there is a delivery deficit, which has got to be done. And lastly, I would say the Indo-Pacific competition, we are caught into that. And there, China's rise and assertion is an important. I want to conclude by saying that earlier China came as a counterbalance to India in the neighborhood on the invitation of the neighbors. China now has its own stakes to get into South Asia. Even if the South Asian countries, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, even if we work with them and they say China, no, China will not be no. China will push itself because China has its own stakes. It has 4 drivers why it wants to be South Asia, want to be in South Asia. South Asia is a big market, 1.6 billion people growing at the rate of 5.5 to 6% on an average. Nobody in the world can ignore that market, and that potential has not been fully utilized. So the South Asia has got to grow. South Asia is bordering China's vulnerable provinces, Tibet and Xinjiang. It cannot ignore some of these countries. South Asia can be a block to China in Indian Ocean. From Malacca Strait, Malacca Dilemma, the Chinese call it. They cannot ignore Indian Ocean. They cannot ignore South Asia and Indian Ocean. And China is worried that if South Asia becomes closer to the US, that's why competition with the MCC, there was a reference in Nepal. There is a reference to MCC in Sri Lanka also. This is a kind of issue which is going on over there. China cannot afford South Asian countries to side with the US. So they have their own reasons. And because of these reasons, they are going to assert themselves very strongly against anything which goes against their interest. And therefore, the Chinese competition is going to be much more severe and much more continuous. It is not going to stop it. So that is a neighborhood challenge which one has to face. I think these are the challenges which we will have to face. The neighborhood 2.0 will have to confront these challenges. The major challenge, I would repeat again, is in terms of 3, China, India's own spillover into the neighborhood, and the turbulence, nationalism, and a new neighborhood. If we can realize them and shape our policies, I think neighborhood can be integrated more closely, not completely, more closely. Why not completely? Because of the identity problem. The neighbors have a problem of their own. Neighbors, I normally use a sentence, the neighbors have no national consensus on how close to India is not too close. They want to be close to India, but how much close they should go to be, there is no national consensus in any of these countries. And because of this lack of consensus, there is a problem when it comes to integrating with India. Look at Sri Lanka's nationalism, which kept us out on the eastern terminal in Colombo, which is even now, even in Trincomalee, which is according to the agreement, Trincomalee form, now they have made a national company. Of course, India has got 49% stakes into that, 51% are still Sri Lankan, but it is there. You go to Bangladesh, anywhere, there is a question of how close you can identify with India, is a question of their own identities, and it will continue to linger on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Muni, for a very elaborate, insightful, suggestive, and some possible solutions as to how do we approach, as you said, neighborhood 2. I think also this. Do you have time to field a few questions?
Yes, I'm ready. I'm available.
Subha, how do you take this on? You're muted, Subha.
Please unmute.
Thank you, sir. I'll take it from here. Now you have heard Professor Muni talking to us. Those who would like to pose a question, you could raise your hand, or you can leave a note in the chat box. I'll call you one by one. We have Ankuran, and then we'll have Aprupa. Sir, we'll take 2-3 questions together. Is that okay, sir?
Okay.
Okay. Ankuran is a postgraduate scholar from Pondicherry University, sir. Ankuran, go ahead.
It was an amazing lecture to listen to, give such a summary inside of everything that has been happening over the historical period of time. My question was about I come from Assam, which has probably experienced this vestiges of illegal immigration for quite a number of years since the crisis emerged. So with the NRC exercise, India has almost dismissed it as an internal matter which doesn't require any form of assistance from outside or anything, but citing its massive humanitarian ramifications and comparisons with Reich citizenship's law. How do you view this crisis in the context of, say, Indo-Bangladesh relation with Bangladesh explicitly telling that we will not take anyone in? Does this put a stain on India's record as a secular country after a period of time? That's what.
Okay. Thank you, Ankuran. Next, I'll call upon Aprupa. Sir, Aprupa, she's our PhD scholar. You have met her. Aprupa, go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Professor Muni. Listening to you it's not surprising. I've listened to you previously, and all of them has been wonderful. So my question is something that what Ankuran was already talking about, but I will put it in from a different perspective. So previously also there has been several issues where the center and the state has differed. So this time when it comes to the migration issues, I'm taking something very recent when the Myanmarese migrant have crossed into Manipur and Mizoram, the state taking different stand on the basis of ethnic similarities from the center. So how do you think that plays out, and whenever there is a difference between the center and the state, and especially when there is a linkage, ethnic linkages involved in that matter? Second question, sir, is something from the extended neighborhood. I was keen to know, sir, about Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia, as you know, there are a lot of Chinese investments, especially in infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia. But every time there's a new leader who comes to power, comes with the political agenda of promise to get away from the Chinese span. For example, Mahathir, who came to power in '93, came with the promise, however, didn't live up to the promise. So do you think, sir, the larger criticism of India not living up to its infrastructural project timeline and other thing, if that we could have overcome, we could have at least come closer to what the Chinese involvement or the impact is in this region? That's one of my questions to you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I'll take one more question, sir. Is it okay?
Okay, go ahead.
I'll invite Ankit. Ankit is a PhD scholar, sir. He is working on Pakistan's economy for his PhD.
Okay.
Ankit, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have two questions for you. Sir, first, as you yourself mentioned that India has a social identity impact on its neighborhood and it's vice versa. In terms of power, it's more nuanced. So when we say that we have that social connection because of the geography and so many historical reasons. Can we say that that our relation, India's relation with our neighbors, have reached a plateau where we don't have to be much concerned about their own engagements with other countries? It's like a relation which has matured, and then have we reached that stage that we can let go of let our neighbors venture out to new possibilities and bring prosperity in all sum. And then the second question is linked to what Ankuran asked you on CAA and NRC. Even I mean, myself have been very pretty dismissive of this fact that there is this right-wing foreign policy impact, transformations coming in the India's foreign policy. I have not really agreed to it, but then as you again that connects to my the first question, the social identity relation. So do you think this will impact the the neighbors, the revolution or the uprising or the dissent in their the way their internal external policy develops on the basis of our India's majoritarian attitude which is being developed right now? I'm saying it's not developed, it's in a transformative phase which will of course go down. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankit. Sir, back to you, sir.
Yeah, all these questions lead me to one general comment which I should first make. It is unfortunate that South Asia there is Subha said, the rise of the right in Pakistan, not only in Pakistan, Subha, rise of right in whole of South Asia, including India. And it is having impact upon them. This Bangladesh temple question, they have on Hasina made a mention of CAA, saying this one. Whether you like it or not, there is an element of communalizing foreign policy towards neighbors in India. And therefore, it will have reactions. Why communalizing? The question of CAA or NRC does not relate only to Bangladesh. Afghanistan now, we got the Sikhs back, we got others, Hindus back. We don't want Muslims. Now, Indian civilization is a far more composite civilization. I think I've been arguing that India will have to own Islam. We have to own Islam because we own Islam. We have contributed to Islam. There are two almost ideological schools which we have given to Islam, Barelvi and Devbandi. Which did good or bad is a different thing. Please look at Islam's character from West Asia on the one hand and Southeast Asia on the other hand. Southeast Asian Islam is far more moderate than the West Asian Islam, which is far more radically prone. The moderation was done by India because it went through India in terms of that. The whole Sufi culture. Now, if that being so, if you isolate Islam from your own composite culture and civilization, you are actually denting your soft power of civilization and culture, which you are promoting on the one hand. And secondly, you are generating reactions because this is what it would happen. And that is happening. You like it or not, it is happening. I think it is being realized gradually that yes, the harm is being done. But political stakes are there, and political stakes at times are very, very bad. Frankly speaking, the question of center-state relations, for instance. You are right in terms of Northeast states having differences, which you said. But these differences are there in other states also. I'm just extending the example. Bangladesh, why are you not signing TISTA when the draft was already agreed to? This draft should have been signed by Manmohan Singh. He committed a mistake by not signing, largely because saving his alliance with Mamta Didi at that time. It is a foreign policy issue, which is the prerogative of the center. And center should look for national interest, not for the provincial interest. But it was largely due to provincial interest that TISTA was not signed. Sri Lanka, we have this fisherman issue. I think Sri Lanka is absolutely correct that your fishermen cannot cross it. Livelihood or no livelihood, sovereignty question is important. But we cannot do it because BJP would want to have a strong foothold in Tamil Nadu. And Mrs. Gandhi had a problem of its alliance with DMK. See, these are the internal problems which spill over into the neighborhood policy. And if we cannot make this distinction, or if we succumb and make compromises, largely because of domestic politics on foreign policy, you will have to pay the price for that. That precisely is happening in terms of all these questions which you raised, except for Southeast Asia. So I hope you got the thrust of what I want to respond to these questions of related to domestic politics. I very forcefully, I have annoyed many friends. I have suffered some because of that by saying that we must own Islam. Don't communalize your foreign policy. Don't communalize your neighborhood policy. We will have to pay for that. And we are paying for that in one reason or another. On Southeast Asia, there is a problem vis-a-vis China, and that includes India. We all have wonderful economic relations with China, but we all have very bad strategic relations with China, whole of Southeast Asia. You know, the dilemma which Sanjay Bharadwaj was mentioning about Bangladesh in terms of economy and democratic development is a dilemma which also exists in relation to China in terms of economic engagement on the one hand and strategic relations on the other. China is open to us economically, want us economically. We want China economically. China does not want to dominate us strategically. We don't accept it. None of the Southeast Asian countries accept it. I mean, not even Cambodia, which has been cowed down to a very large extent. Vietnam, you know, I mentioned to you the structural imbalance in South Asia is not a typical Indian problem. Many times we blame India that you have your problem with the neighbors. Tell me which big country does not have a problem with the neighbors? The US has it with Cuba and Mexico. Look at the way they are bringing a wall or border on Mexico, where the Americans are doing it. Look at the Chinese, they have a problem with Mongolia and Vietnam. In Mongolia, Dalai Lama visited and the Chinese became so furious. Anywhere you go, this is a real problem because of the existential nature, and we should not be unnecessarily apologetic that, you know, we have only it in South Asia. No, it's not in South Asia. It is a structural problem which is inherent into the situation, and one will have to cope with it. You can't wish it away. So is the case in Southeast Asia, that Southeast Asia, everybody is benefiting by relations with China, and everybody is shit scared because of China. So what do you do with that?
So we'll take one more round.
Sure.
Now we'll move to the second round. Would anyone like to pose a question? Kindly raise your hand or...
Subha, shall I ask one question, sir?
Sanjay, please, go ahead.
Sir, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, so thank you very much for your enlightening lecture about South Asian. Sir, I'm just looking that India wants to set the terms and conditions for the neighboring countries to entertain the extra-regional powers or to align with this country or that country and raise its concern, while India itself believes in multi-alignment foreign policy. While the neighboring countries are looking for having multi-alignment at a time with China or with Russia or with America, we have a lot of concerns, we have a lot of apprehensions. Don't you feel that India is having a double standards in the policy or approaching to the extra-regional powers in the case of multi-alignment, where India is believing to have aligned at a time with number of organizations and number of countries, and doesn't allow the neighboring countries and wants to set their rules and terms. Yes, sir. Sir.
Anyone else?
President Nagappa has a question. President.
I just wanted to check with you the importance of what type of role science and technology in terms of diplomacy we can play positively. Past few things we sort of goofed up, in my opinion. We said we'll make a South Asia satellite, except Bhutan, hardly anybody used it. There was no requirement. Vaccine policy, we started in a big way, again made a mess of it because of our own internal requirements we didn't calculate properly and all that sort of thing. But maybe today we are in a better position, I don't know. But overall, if you take, therefore, science and technology and diplomacy associated with it as a tool, what type of impact we can make, putting the other type of constraints which you already mentioned, how do we overcome that? How do we really make some sort of an impact?
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Sir, let mine be the last question to you. You talked about the center state differences. We also talked earlier on India's problem with the periphery, its own periphery. And also all neighbors also have their own peripheries, the difference between the center and the periphery. Since you were addressing how we can look at this, would kind of a federalizing our foreign policy in which we take the inputs of the state, or looking at the neighborhood from the state, maybe in Chennai, maybe in Kolkata, because most of the time the chief ministers come only to the prime minister office. They hardly visit the MEA, or the MEA go into. Would a kind of a federalizing our foreign policy, the way the Chinese are trying to do, give a lead to, say, Sichuan or Yunnan province, would that help address our neighborhood policy? So,
to begin with, Sanjay's question of multi-alignment. No, Sanjay, we are not worried about multi-alignment of the neighbors. In fact, we are one country which has allowed many of our neighbors to become the member of United Nations and various other organizations. Nepal had faced that problem. Bangladesh, we were there in the beginning. Sri Lanka, in the human rights issue, we go. That's not the issue. The issue is when an adversarial country increases its influence in the neighborhood, we have a problem. And this is what it is related to, as I mentioned to you, during the Cold War, we were worried about the American influence and American presence. Many of you do not know that in 1954, when Nehru was visiting at that time Nepal, there were black flag demonstrations. And these black flag demonstrations were funded by the USI, United States Information Service. We were not with the Cold War. We were not with Americans, and they were unhappy with us. And they would be present in this sensitive neighborhood because they were watching China for their own reason in one way or the other. And we allowed Nepal to go closer to China. Have 56, they had diplomatic relations with them. But now we are not happy with that. It's a question of adversarial power and no adversarial power. The Americans would be worried about the Soviet Union in Cuba, but if India goes to Cuba, they have no problem. So the question is not of their multi-alignment. You are right. I mean, they have a right to have economic relations with everybody else. Today, they are having, most of the neighbors are having economic relations with China. And in most of the dialogue, we are telling our neighboring countries, have economic relations. If you want to have aid, trade, whatever you want to have it. But the condition is that it should not adversely affect India's security and strategic interests. You cannot open a commercial port and use it for submarines. We would then have problems. So this is what our problem is in relation to their relations with either Russia or China. Pakistan is having relations with Russia. We have no problem. We have been talking with them. But if the Russians have given BrahMos to us, if they also give BrahMos to Pakistan, we would have a problem. and naturally so. The Russians have given BrahMos to us, the Chinese have a problem. So it's a question of the nature of relationship which is more critical. And if it is adversarial relationship, then we would find it hard to endorse that. And certainly we would plead with the neighbor to see that not much of our stakes, strategic interests are affected adversely. That's all it is. Otherwise, theoretically, you cannot have. India has $100 billion of trade with China. How can you ask any other country not to have trade with China? With face, you can go and say that. You cannot do that. But you can raise objections for a port being converted into submarine base, or for a road being used for strategic purposes, or an airport being used for strategic purposes. You can have objections there, because they would have objections there also. So that is what the difference is. Sir, the question on science, I'm sure you are aware that the RIS, the Delhi-based RIS, these days have a bulletin on science diplomacy. You know, we have coined a new word called defense diplomacy. For the first time under Neighbourhood First policy, we are starting to sell arms to our neighbors, which we never did earlier. And now we have even given money to Vietnam and Bangladesh, line of credit to Vietnam and Bangladesh to buy arms from us. Similarly, science is a very powerful instrument, tool of foreign policy. And we are using it. But sometimes we feel, sir, you mentioned vaccine. Now, if we had taken money and did not deliver vaccine, you know this, to Saudi Arabia. They had paid for it, we could not deliver on time. So it's a delivery deficit. If you cannot deliver something which you have promised on time, next time nobody would come to you. The Chinese would deliver it on time. Satellite was really being questioned, and satellite, the Pakistanis were raising an objection that satellite would give us an access to also what satellite does in other countries. So they had strategic reservations. So we will have to find out ways and means scientifically to make them sure that their privacy is not encroached by us by using our science. Otherwise, we are a vaccine country all over the world. I think we are not only a vaccine country, we are a pharma country all over the world. I think medicines are going all over the world. But that is just one thing. We are giving nuclear technologies to Bangladesh and to Vietnam. So we have various ways in which we are using science technology as a part of diplomacy. And now there is I don't have those details with me, but every week or every fortnight, the RIS is putting out a bulletin, whether it is agriculture science, whether it is manufacturing area, whether it is, we are not too good on road building, so we are not doing it. But any area where we can really, that is what the developmental assistance is. So we can very, very strongly use science, and I think we are using it. I can't give you the details because, as I said, it is listed almost every week what the scientific agreements we are doing. Not only in terms of satellite, the nuclear, for instance, medicines. We are giving nuclear technology to many other countries. Now, lastly, on Suva's federal questions, see, the neighboring states would always be a factor in any foreign policy, Suva. And this is, one will have to see what is the difference between your broader national interest and the local state interest of the neighboring country. I give you one example. When Nehru was signing this Gandak and Kosi agreements with Nepal, in implementing those agreements, he put in Bihar engineers there. Now, Bihar engineers had Bihar perspective also. So they did something which eventually became a liability. And we had to do a lot of other corrections in doing that. I gave you those examples to you of the fishermen in Tamil Nadu or Teesta River, because BJP wants to have strong stakes in West Bengal. That's why they are not, because if they sign Teesta Agreement, Mamta would tear them out and say they have sold out the West Bengal interests. So the federal relations, but a lot of federalism is now going into India's foreign policy. I think MEA has even set up some cells to deal with the federal concerns. A chief minister, if he has to go out, he has to seek permission of the MEA or the PM or whatever else it is. It's not only MEA. Modi was denied when he was chief minister even to go to Sri Lanka when he was going for textile mills and others. He wanted some textile to be brought in from Sri Lanka, was willing to do that, whatever else it is. So there is a certain now coordination mechanism. Earlier we did not have. Now more and more need for that coordination mechanism has arising, not because of federal structure, because within the federal structure, the political governance has changed. See, earlier it was Congress all over. So it didn't matter. Now it matters. If you have one party in power in one state, then the center, then the problem would arise. Now Mamta Mamta was objecting to Teesta during UPA when the coalition was there. Her main objection was not Teesta. Her main objection was that West Bengal should be treated especially. And he asked Pranab Mukherjee to give special assistance, who was then finance minister, to West Bengal. And since they did not, she said, okay, then I won't approve of this agreement. So there are various problems. I think I'm forgetting the name. She has done a book on state satraps and foreign policy, in which some of these states like Tamil Nadu and others have been analyzed. She's a journalist, was very close to Narasimha Rao. I'll give you the name somewhere else who has done that book. But the problem really is not with the federal structure because of the political tension which were there. If it is the same political party, you can always resolve within your party structure, like between Punjab and the center. I mean, they had all the time. Mrs. Gandhi even ran that Bhindranwala action in Punjab. So the main problem is political, not constitutional.
Okay.
But constitutionally, the two have different versions. So there must be some mechanism. And I assure you that India has already started under Jaishankar, not only Jaishankar, even before that, but Jaishankar has strengthened that, how to deal with the neighborhood, foreign neighborhood nuances or sensitivities.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that lecture and also taking questions. Now I'll invite Professor Srikumar Pullet, the head of our program, to formally propose a vote of thanks for delivering the K. Subrahmanyam Memorial Lecture. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Subha. So it's my proud privilege to offer the vote of thanks to Professor Muni, who talked to us about India and its neighborhood as part of the K. Subrahmanyam Memorial Lecture. I'm sure the audience, the extended audience in the social media also have benefited from the points that he brought out in his discussion, and also the question and answer session. I would also like to thank Professor Rajaram Nagappa for chairing the session. I would like to thank Dr. Shailesh Naik, Director NIAS, for sparing his time. I saw Professor Ramurthy has also attended the sessions today. Thanks to you, sir. I would like to offer special thanks to the speakers of the morning session. Dr. Manoharan, Dr. Karthikeyan, Dr. Bibu Prasad Otrai, Professor Sanjay Bhardraj, Dr. Anshuman Bera, and Dr. Subha Chandran. And a special mention of thanks to the discussants, Aprupa, Ashwini, Akriti, Ramya, Blessy, Abigail, Ankit, Saurina, and the young scholars and experts and professionals from our partner institutions who have been with us throughout the day. And I would like to thank my team, the ISSP team, Professor Soundarajan, Subha Chandran for organizing the whole day event, and the others, the other youngsters in Subha's team who have done the background work in organizing today's event. As we recalled in the morning, it was supposed to be some sort of a face-to-face sort of an event, but we have to do it in the virtual medium. I would like to also thank the audience who may have joined from the virtual media for this session. Thanks to you all once again. Back to Subha.